The night wrapped itself around the taxi driver Dave in a cold embrace. He had spent long hours behind the wheel, and now that the last order had been completed, he was eager to get home. The deserted highway, surrounded by forests, seemed endless and gloomy. Only occasionally did the moonlight break through the clouds, leaving pale reflections on the asphalt. Dave turned on the radio, but it only emitted strange static and whispers. He was too tired to pay attention to it, and simply continued driving, concentrating on the road. Suddenly, he noticed a figure in the distance on the side of the road, an old woman with white hair fluttering in the wind, wearing a long dress. Dave felt a chill of fear and decided not to stop. As he drove past, he glanced in the mirror and saw in horror that the old woman was standing on the side of the road again, looking straight at him. His heart began to beat faster, but he tried to drive away. However, a few minutes later she appeared on the road again, standing as if nothing had happened, as if time had compressed and brought her back to the same stretch of road. The feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. Dave decided to stop, although he felt that it was a bad idea. He stopped the car next to the figure. Grandma leaned towards the window and, looking into his eyes, said in a hoarse voice,
"Can you give me a ride to the cemetery? I'll pay."
Dave hesitated, but something in her eyes made him agree. She was silent on the way, her gaze fixed on the window, but her presence filled the car with an eerie silence. Soon they arrived at a cemetery, shrouded in fog. Granny asked him to wait and left. Dave waited for 10 minutes, then 20. His nerves were on edge, and he was about to leave when Granny returned.
"He's not here," she said. "Let's go to another cemetery."
Despite his displeasure, Dave agreed. They went to another cemetery, but there too, Grandma disappeared into the fog and did not return for a long time. Eventually, she reappeared with the same answer.
"He's not here," she said. "Let's go to another cemetery."
At the third cemetery, Dave waited in the car, feeling the fear tightening in his chest. He almost fell asleep when he heard a knock on the window. Opening his eyes, he saw his grandmother, but her face was different now. Her clothes were covered in blood, and she was holding something strange in her hand.
"We arrived where we needed to be."
Dave felt the coldness take over his body. That was the last thing he remembered before his consciousness faded. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the car. He was lying on the cold ground, surrounded by graves. Grandma was standing over him with a creepy grin on her face.
"You should have known that we would all end up here,"
she whispered, and the world went dark.
The night was dark and cold when cabbie Jack O'Malley pulled into his shift. The sky was overcast and the stars were out, as if the world was about to hold its breath. Jack climbed into the old Chevy he'd had since he started driving. He knew the city like the back of his hand, but something felt different tonight. At first, his shift was quiet. He drove around the streets, filling his account with small jobs. But as the clock ticked past midnight, something ominous began to fill the air. He stopped at a traffic light and glanced in his side mirror. Nothing out of the ordinary, just blurry lights and shadows from passing cars. But a feeling of unease crept up inside him. Suddenly, his cell phone vibrated and a new job message appeared on the screen. The address was on the outskirts of town, in an old neighborhood that had once been considered prosperous, but was now abandoned and dangerous. Jack felt a slight chill, but work was work. He headed in that direction. When he reached the designated place, an ominous silence enveloped him. The dilapidated houses stood as if forgotten by ghosts. He turned on the headlights and illuminated the empty street. After standing for a while, Jack decided that perhaps his order had been canceled. However, at that moment he noticed a moving shadow in the back window of the car. The car door opened and a girl got in. She was dressed in a long white dress, her hair was disheveled, and her eyes seemed empty, like the night sky. Jack tensed up, but trying not to show it, he asked, "Where should I give you a ride?"
"To the cemetery."
Jack was surprised. A cemetery at such a late hour? Nevertheless, he nodded and drove off. The girl sat quietly, looking out the window. At that moment, he did not know that this trip itself would be his last. On the way, he tried to start a conversation, but she remained silent, only throwing an anxious glance at him from time to time. The silence inside the car was becoming unbearable. Finally, Jack asked. Jack was surprised. A cemetery at such a late hour? Nevertheless, he nodded and drove off. The girl sat quietly, looking out the window. At that moment, he did not know that this trip itself would be his last. On the way, he tried to start a conversation, but she remained silent, only throwing an anxious glance at him from time to time. The silence inside the car was becoming unbearable. Finally, Jack asked, "What brought you there?" She turned her head and looked at him with an expression of sadness.
"I'm looking for my father,"
she said with a slight tremor in her voice.
"He's there, at the cemetery."
Jack felt something strange come over him. Who is this girl in a white dress, looking for her father in a cemetery on a night like this, he thought. But instead of asking her, he just kept driving, trying not to pay attention to it. Soon they arrived at the cemetery. Darkness swallowed everything around, and the sounds of the night were only the whisper of the wind. The girl got out of the car and said. Jack stayed in the car, but his heart was pounding with anxiety. He leaned his elbows on the steering wheel and tried to relax when he noticed shadows flickering in the windows of the old graves. He shuddered and tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination. A few minutes passed, but the girl did not return. Time dragged on, and despite all his desire to stay, Jack felt he had to check on her. He got out of the car and slowly walked towards the graves. The silence was overwhelming. Old monuments stood around him, their names faded and pale. He walked between the graves, calling out to the girl. "Hey! Where are you?" There was no answer. His fear was growing when he noticed a figure sitting in the distance on one of the graves. It was her. But something was wrong. She sat with her head down, and there were red stains on her clothes. Jack ran closer, and when he saw her face, he was overcome with horror. Her eyes were empty, and she was smiling as if she was not alive. She raised her head and looked at him, and then extended her hand, indicating something behind her back.
"I found him,"
she said, and her voice was like a whisper from the grave. Jack turned around and saw a figure standing behind him, a silhouette of a man in dark clothes, with a rotten smile. He looked just like his father had described him. Suddenly, Jack knew something was wrong. He ran back to the car, his heart pounding in his chest. But then he felt a cold hand grab his shoulder.
"You won't leave,"
the girl said, her voice full of menace. He broke free from her grip and ran to the car, feeling something dark chasing him. He opened the door with difficulty, climbed inside and locked it. He grabbed the keys and started the engine. But when he looked in the side mirror, he saw her and her father standing next to the car, their faces cut with fear and hatred. He pressed the gas to the floor and drove away from the cemetery without looking back. For several miles on the road he felt safe, but the fear did not leave him. He tried to convince himself that all this was just a nightmare, but an inner voice whispered, "This will not end." When he drove out onto the lighted street, Jack decided to stop and calm down. He was breathing heavily when suddenly his phone vibrated again. It was a new order. He picked up the receiver, and the voice on the other end was strange and dark. "Hello, Jack. You haven't forgotten about your passenger?" A voice that seemed familiar rang out. Jack dropped the phone as if it was burning him. He looked out the window and saw the same figure in a white dress standing next to his car. She raised her hand and waved at him, as if saying goodbye. Everything inside him broke. At that moment, he realized he could no longer leave this night. He had become part of this dark ritual, part of the legend of ghosts who continue to search for their loved ones, finding no peace. Every night, when darkness falls, Jack will go out on duty again, and perhaps someone else will get into his car. But he will always remember that he once made this choice, and now his fate is tied to the shadows that roam the cemeteries.
Mike always considered himself a practical man. He worked at a car repair shop in a small town in Wisconsin and spent long hours at work. But one night, as he was driving home after a shift, he felt that all his habits and rationality were about to go awry. It was already around midnight when he pulled out of the parking lot. Mike reached for the radio, but the car was playing only static. He turned on the headlights, and they illuminated the empty road that led to his hometown. The weather was foggy, and the smell of rain was in the air. He drove along a familiar route, but suddenly, without waiting for a traffic light, he decided to turn onto one of the side streets. He had a strange premonition that this route might be faster. But as soon as he turned, he realized that something was wrong. The road seemed old, unkempt, and the trees on both sides almost touched the roof of his car. "Damn, I should have kept going," he muttered, cursing his spontaneity. As he drove further, the forest became thicker and the air became filled with something ominous. Fog spread along the road, making it difficult to see. Mike tried to tune the radio, but instead of music, all that came out of the speakers were whispers and strange sounds that made him shudder. "It's just radio interference," he reassured himself. But the feeling of anxiety did not leave him. Suddenly, in the light of his headlights, he noticed something on the side of the road. It was an old sign with barely legible text: "Do not drive further. Danger!" His heart began to beat faster. Thinking that it might just be a joke, he continued driving, hoping that he would soon find his way back. After a few minutes, he noticed that the darkness around him was thickening. The trees that had looked normal before now seemed alive, with sharp branches, as if they were trying to reach out to him. For a moment he thought he saw silhouettes moving between the trees, but he decided it was just a trick of the light. Finally, he noticed something strange ahead, a dim light flickering in the forest. Mike decided that maybe there was someone there who could help him. He turned off the road and drove a little deeper into the forest until he saw a house. It was an old abandoned mansion that looked like no one had touched it for many years. "Oh shit," he muttered. "What do I do now?" Not knowing what else to do, he got out of the car and headed towards the house. The walls were covered in moss, and the windows were boarded up. However, the light seemed to be coming from one of the window frames. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. There were sounds inside that resembled whispers. It was strange, but Mike still hoped to find help. He walked around the house and saw a door ajar in the backyard. Coming closer, he looked inside and froze. There were old, dusty things there, moldy furniture, and all sorts of rusty junk. But most importantly, in the center of the room there was a round table with many objects on it that looked like amulets and strange symbols. On the walls there were drawings depicting terrible scenes that terrified him. Mike decided that it was time to leave, but at that moment his attention was drawn to something shiny on the table. It was an old medal sparkling in the dim light. He reached out to take it, and at that moment there was a dull thud. His heart went cold. He turned around and saw the door close, and the air in the room became unbearably heavy. The walls seemed alive, and the whispers around him grew louder. Realizing that he was stuck in this horrible place, he rushed to the door, but it was locked. Mike began to panic. He looked for a way out, but the whole house seemed like a nightmare. At first, he only heard whispers, but now they were getting louder. He looked around and finally saw silhouettes of people in the darkness. Their faces were distorted, their eyes full of hatred and fear.
"You came into our trap.
A voice rang out that seemed both familiar and alien.
We were waiting for you."
And couldn't believe what was happening. His heart was pounding and his legs wouldn't obey him. He suddenly remembered the stories of people disappearing in these woods, the legends that circulated in his town. At that moment, he realized that he had become a victim of one of them. In horror, he saw the silhouettes approaching, their hands reaching out to him. He rushed to the door again, but it remained closed. Suddenly, to his relief, the door swung open and he ran outside without looking back. Mike jumped into his car and started the engine. He glanced at the house and was overcome with a feeling of horror when he noticed that the faces of those who lived here were now visible in the windows, all of them looking at him with hatred and anger. Slowing down, He broke into the road, trying to get away from this nightmare. But as he returned, the forest began to seem more and more ominous. He continued to feel like something was following him, and the whispers did not stop in his head. When he finally reached the familiar road, the headlights illuminated his house, but the anxiety did not leave him. He ran inside and closed the door behind him, but the noise of whispers continued to sound in his ears. Since then, every night when he fell asleep, Mike saw those faces, and the whispers grew louder. He knew that this evening would not end for him until he could get rid of this curse. He became a prisoner of his own spontaneity and would never be able to get rid of the dark road that led him to this house. And although he tried to lead a normal life, he knew that no matter how far he went, the shadows from the forest would always follow him, because he was already a part of this dark story.